So I'm here to introduce Vera to Velde. Vera has an honours degree in Maths and Economics from the California Institute of Technology, as well as a PhD from UC Berkeley. She has recently arrived in Australia and is now working at the University of Queensland as a lecturer of economics. Her research in the past has included work on experimental economics, behavioural economics and game theory, and today, as you know, her speech will be on behavioural economics. So when you hear of behavioural economics, you probably often hear about people making mistakes and people maybe behaving irrationally, and this is often used to justify more government intervention. However, Vera is going to give us a different perspective. So, Vera.
Thank you very much. While I get this open up again, I wanted to thank once again John and Tim for putting together such an enjoyable conference. I'm having a really fun time. You all are too. And thank you for showing up this morning after what you're probably either sleep deprived at best or hungover at worst after last night. So I'm motivated to give this speech when I met John quite recently, actually. By my experience with interactions with both libertarians and non-libertarians that I meet regularly. I think I have a special talent for giving people a wide menu of reasons to dislike me. And when it comes to non-libertarians, pretty much anytime I go out in public with short sleeves, they see the first welfare theorem tattoo I have on my shoulder and instantly are sort of incredulous that I actually buy into that free market crap. And then when I talk to the libertarians and they find out I'm a behavioral economist, I encounter a lot of skepticism about how that might influence my views on paternalism. In fact, I think there's someone here today, or maybe they didn't actually show up as they promised, who happened to meet my partner last week, and it came out that he would be attending this conference, and so Matt told him, oh, you should go see Vera talk about behavioral economics, and the response was, oh, I don't like behavioral economists because they think everyone is dumb and they need government help to make their decisions. So hopefully I can be at least one counterexample to that view. So I'll start with at least defining what behavioral economics is, because I think there's a bit of a misconception. It's such a popular topic lately in popular culture, starting with Freakonomics and Dan Ariely and many other authors that have written wildly successful popular science books on these topics. So behavioral economics actually does not really incorporate things like Freakonomics. As much as I would love for my field to be able to take some credit for Steve Levitt, who is a brilliant economist, and Freakonomics is incredibly well written and enjoyable, behavioral economics is actually anything that doesn't really fall into that category of classic incentives that microeconomists know how to analyze. So behavioral economics is almost defined as that negation, is anything where our traditional assumptions of people as being perfectly self-interested and perfectly rational break down, essentially. And so this incorporates settings like how people make decisions under risk, how they deal with time trade-offs in not necessarily the way we might expect them to. People are imperfect about self-control and following through on plans. It incorporates social preferences, which is my area of research, altruism, social norms, etc. And it also incorporates heuristics and biases, and these are a lot of the reasons that are often used as justification for wanting government to step in and help people make their decisions. So in terms of public policy, there's a lot of different ways that behavioral economics can play a role in shaping that. In the first 3 bullet points here, these roles of government, such as providing public services and preventing harm to others, preventing us from harming others, and rectifying externalities. Behavioral economics, I think, primarily plays a role in terms of improving the government's approach to these problems. And that's kind of what that book Nudge is about, which I'm guessing you probably have at least heard of, since it's there's a nudge unit, in fact, in the British government, and there's something similar in the United States recently. And so that class of things, this is a fantastic book and I highly recommend it, but this class of things is not really what I want to talk about, because it is an entirely freedom-preserving approach to incorporating behavioral economics into government. They call it libertarian paternalism, which is a phrase that I thoroughly loathe, but the libertarian part is a serious component of that, in the sense that preserving freedom is always a priority. It's that fourth alleged role of government that I want to discuss more today, and this alleged role being that the government should be protecting people from themselves in a paternalistic nanny state. So I think the first objection I have to the notion that behavioral economics might call for more paternalism is really just based on a sort of large-scale misunderstanding of what behavioral economics actually entails. It's not a replacement for classical economics. When I meet people who are disillusioned by economics after the last financial crisis, and they say to me, oh, you're one of the big behavioral economists, you're one of the good guys, you're going to replace the old paradigm and fix the world going forward, hopefully. That's actually really kind of far from the mark. We're definitely not replacing classical economics. All of the utilitarian justifications you might have for libertarianism based on the efficiency of free markets is still entirely true. And I take absolutely no issue with those results and with that approach. Behavioral economics really just focuses on the minority of situations or other realms where markets are not involved and competitive pressures don't drive the aggregate outcome, where a more nuanced view of human preferences can get us farther into understanding how people behave. So behavioral really doesn't mean that people are irrational or even mistaken necessarily in certain situations, but definitely not overall. And it's still true that people do know what's best for themselves. In fact, to an economist, that's almost a tautology, because we define welfare in terms of people's preferences, and that's still true for a behavioral economist. So there still is that great degree of respect for what people say they want. So there are four categories of anomalies that behavioral economics has identified that I want to go through. First of all, there's a lot of so-called mistakes that I think may not be actual mistakes. A lot of times I'm very confident that they're not mistakes. In other cases, the jury's still out, we'll see, but it's certainly not a given. Then there are mistakes that are mistakes for some people, but not overall. And this also might fall into that third category of mistakes that are too costly to cure. If we try and fix those mistakes for some people, we're going to make others worse off who weren't making the mistake in the first place. Then there are behavioral anomalies that actually, I think, if anything, say that government intervention is even less necessary than we might believe originally. And then I would like to just propose a metric, a more rigorous metric for identifying true mistakes, identifying actual opportunities where people might benefit from some kind of intervention, and how you go about providing that intervention is then an entirely separate debate. I still prefer not to rely on government solutions, but this is the more overall libertarian debate that we've all been having in general. All right, so let's start with one really famous example of a behavioral so-called anomaly, and a particularly powerful one, actually, and these are default effects. So this graph shows rates of agreeing to be an organ donor in various Western European countries. And you can see that among countries like Austria, Belgium, France, nearly everyone in the population has signed up to be an organ donor. And in very, very similar countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK, and Germany, the rates are much, much lower. So it's pretty implausible that attitudes towards the need for organ donation are actually that dramatically different between these countries. The key driver for these wide disparities in rates is purely because in the blue countries here, it's the default that people are presumed to consent, and you have to actively opt out if you don't want to be an organ donor. Whereas in those yellow countries, you do have to actively opt in if you want to be considered as an organ donor. So these default effects are incredibly powerful. Here's another example from retirement savings. The dark black bars on the left of each contribution rate are the contribution rates when the default for a particular company was a zero contribution. And you can see that 63% of people were not contributing to a 401k, despite the fact that there are highly beneficial, highly profitable matching schemes with the employer. When they switched to a default rate of 3% that you then had to actively change, that entire bump at zero moved over to 3%. So it's clear that a lot of people who were choosing not to contribute to a 401k previously were doing so not because they thought that that was the best approach to their retirement savings, but because they just hadn't gotten around to changing it for weeks or months or years. So one interpretation of this default effects is that people are making mistakes by not making active choices, by putting off decisions. And I think that was part of the reason behind when the approach that Sweden took when they privatized their social security system. What they did is they ran this very aggressive campaign, example advertisement on the right, which I can't translate for you, unfortunately. But they had a very aggressive campaign trying to get people to actively choose an investment portfolio to replace the previous social security system. And the government did, in fact, choose a default fund for those who didn't want to make that active choice, but it was highly discouraged from just taking the default. And you can see that this comparison table, people who did actively choose a fund did so in ways that are not necessarily recommended financially, despite the fact that these ads aggressively recommended diversifying and choosing low-fee indexed funds. The fees were on average much higher than the default fund and much less diversified. And in fact, the returns over the next 7 years demonstrated that people who did make that active choice, who you might have thought actually expected to have made much better choices than the government themselves, because there's a selection bias, right? The people who feel themselves to be competent in making these decisions are the ones more likely to actually make that decision. Nonetheless, these actively chosen funds did vastly worse than the government default. So my interpretation of this is that this is not a fluke at all. I think people are actually learning from defaults. They see a default and they say, oh, well, someone who has thought through this much more carefully than I have has chosen this as a reasonable option, and when I go with that as the default, I'm just allowing myself to learn from other people's experience, not necessarily putting off a decision that I actually want to be making. So there are other behavioral anomalies that I would also say are not necessarily mistakes, but frequently are learning from context. So this effect called coherent arbitrariness, this is a funny experiment that Dan Ariely ran. He asked people in different classes that he taught, different sections of the same class. I'm going to be reciting poetry at a performance later this week. And he asked one class, how much are you willing to pay for 1 minute of this performance, or 3 minutes, or 6 minutes? And that's the graph on top. And this was an incentivized experiment. The reported quantities were what they actually had to pay if it was less than the, well, there's a way of eliciting correct responses, and it was used. So they did actually attend this thing if their fee was high enough, essentially. And you see that there's a consistent relationship here. People are actually willing to pay more for 2 minutes of poetry reciting than 1 minute, as you would expect. But when he framed it a different way and asked people, how much do you have to be paid in order to listen to me recite poetry? You still get consistent answers, but the sign has flipped. People are required then to be paid more to sit through 6 minutes of poetry reciting compared to 1 minute. So just framing that question in a different way gets you entirely different answers. And this is sort of seen as, by some people, as evidence that people don't have stable rational preferences. And I would argue instead that people are learning from context. If it's suggested to you by the question that this is something you should be paid for, then you learn from that and update your beliefs about the experience and state your willingness to pay or willingness to accept differently. The decoy effect, this is a famous one as well, and a strategy that's typically employed by restaurants and movie theaters, where if you have something that's very expensive on the menu, no one's really expected to buy that one, but they are expected to buy more of the thing that's slightly less expensive that they wouldn't normally do. So if you just had a $3 popcorn and a $6.50 popcorn, you would expect a lot of people to just buy the $3 one because it's vastly cheaper. If you have that $7 popcorn, it makes this one that's $6.50 look a lot more reasonable, and people tend to bump up. And then once they choose, the $6.50 one, it's only 50 cents more to get the $7 one, so they bump up even further. I think even in this situation where I think maybe it's clear that people should realize that they're being manipulated, nonetheless, the mental state that leads to this phenomenon in the first place might just be another manifestation of learning from context. If you see many options for large popcorns and you don't really know exactly how much popcorn you want to eat, that seems like more of a typical amount. And you say, well, I'm probably a pretty normal person, I should get a large like everyone else seems to be doing. Compromise effect, probably a similar thing I would say going on. The compromise effect is the tendency for people to choose the middle option if there are multiple dimensions, such as size and price. If you have two options, a small 250 coffee or a large 350 coffee, you might have a lot of people choosing the 250 coffee. Whereas if you introduce an extra large for $5, then now you'll get a much larger fraction of the population choosing 350 just because it is that middle option. Previously there was no middle option. And once again, I think this could just represent learning from context. If I go into the coffee store and I don't know exactly which size I want, and I think, well, I'm just about medium hungry, I'm a pretty typical person, I'll just go with the medium option here. That seems to be a reasonable inference to make. Choice overload. This is another famous, very funny experiment where in a farmer's market, one jam, I don't know if you know, have noticed in farmers markets, there's oftentimes jam stands where they have samples of all the different flavors. For some reason I've seen this a lot, I don't know why. But they ran an experiment where they had one display with 24 different varieties of jam and a different display where they had only 6 varieties. A lot more people stopped to sample the jam at the 24 variety stand, but very few people actually ended up buying from that stand. A lot more people ended up buying from the stand with 6 varieties. And that sort of makes perfect intuitive sense if the choice is easier. So I don't necessarily think this is a mistake at all. I think it's quite obvious how this is not a mistake, but it is a behavioral anomaly in the sense that classical economics assumes that preferences can be essentially indexed by money or represented by money, whereas this example shows that we also have preferences and constraints with regards to our mental computational abilities. We might choose to expend that mental energy on a more important choice than jam and just sidestep the 24 options. Heuristics and biases. This is a fun one because heuristics are almost unambiguously seen as imperfect ways of making decisions. But this experiment actually shows that even simple heuristics might actually be a fantastic way for people to go about making judgments in their everyday life. So this was a test where simply based on a few different factors like distance from a river, whether or not there's a university, latitude, things like that, how can you guess whether or not, which of two German cities is the largest, has the largest population? And they used some very cutting-edge statistical modeling techniques to estimate this data set and then make out-of-sample predictions. And those are the triangles and circles here, whereas a simple heuristic where you take the most significant factor and you only base your decision on that one factor outperforms both of these sophisticated statistical models. And the interpretation here by the authors who ran the study is that when you have very complex systems, if you do fit a complex statistical model, you're essentially building in a lot of assumptions. And in a very complex system, any one of those assumptions could very easily be wrong. Whereas if you have a very simple heuristic, there's less room to be making mistakes essentially in your model. So a simple heuristic that performs very well in a wide variety of very complex settings may actually be the best approach that humans could be taking, rather than a more rational Bayesian updating sort of approach. So yeah, that about sums it up for the types of mistakes and anomalies that I think probably are not all mistakes, and therefore not reasons to be helping people make decisions. Then there's the more fundamental issue that people are diverse, of course. There is certainly such a thing as rational addiction. Becker came up with this theory of rational addiction back in the 60s, where people anticipate that they're going to be addicted and there will be long-run consequences to smoking cigarettes, but they enjoy it so much that they consciously make that trade-off. There's also rational consumption of allegedly unhealthy goods. So when New York City tried to ban oversized sodas last year, I think fortunately this was not actually implemented. This one's hit home for me because I drink massive quantities of Diet Coke all the time, and this is a conscious choice that I make. I realize that maybe there's some health detriments even to Diet Coke with no sugar, but I choose to drink it anyway, and so the government interfering in that choice by making me buy multiple small ones is pretty irritating to my nanny state sensibilities. Rational exploitation, consenting adults can engage in sex trade, for example, perfectly rationally. This does not necessarily entail exploitation or any non-rationality on the part of either individual. I don't think I need to argue that point to this crowd. So even when certain people in these situations might be making mistakes, a lot of people aren't, and it's hard to know which is which. And if we try and help people avoid one type of decision, we're going to be necessarily inflicting a different type of mistake on a different subset of the population. This also means that there's going to be there's always costs and benefits to government policies. For example, when the government tries to correct externalities, even if you believe that that's a legitimate role of government, as I do, I'm a proud member of the Pigouvian Club, as Greg Mankiw calls it. A lot of them are not even worthwhile. Even if there is a significant externality, the cost of correcting it is not going to be worth it compared to the utility that you're preserving by doing so, and that's the case here as well. So how do we actually identify true mistakes? I would propose the criterion that we should go back to the basics of respecting revealed preferences. I think we should be looking for active demand for assistance with decision making by the people who will be manipulated. So I think usually we see demand for intervention by people who are not actually going to be the ones affected by the policy. We see demand for soda regulation by people who don't want their kids to have access to sugary soda. We see it from people who don't want to pay the health bills of people who make bad decisions. And in that case, despite the fact that I completely sympathize with that feeling, that I think that they should be arguing against having to pay the medical bills of others who make bad choices, rather than to restrict those choices even further. yeah, so I don't really see too much evidence that people who are drinking these large oversized sodas are asking to have that choice restricted. But there are other situations where we do see this kind of active demand for assistance. And usually this comes up in the context of self-regulation and commitment devices. So there's this whole class of websites that you've probably heard of. I've gotten a lot of press lately, stick.com, beminder.org, a whole bunch of them devoted just to exercise and dieting. A Herc is in different variants. So most of these, you pledge some amount of money, and if you fail to achieve whatever goal you define, then you forfeit that money. A Herc is a little different in the sense that you upload a compromising picture of yourself, and if your friends vote that you did not achieve your goal, it gets posted to Facebook. There's other goods you can buy that also help with commitment. There's a phone app where, as an alarm clock, you have to vigorously shake your phone for an extended period of time to get it to turn off. My favorite one that I didn't know about until I was looking for a picture is this flying alarm clock. When it goes off, that thing spins up and flies around your apartment, and you have to go retrieve it and plug it back in to get the alarm to turn off. There are other apps that help people avoid making mistakes, like sending drunk texts and drunk emails that you can install, and you have to compute a bunch of math problems before you're allowed to send. And you can set the times ahead of time. There are voluntary exclusion programs. I don't know if this exists in Australia. I haven't been here long enough, but in the US, a lot of states have laws. You're nodding that this does exist. In the US, a lot of states have programs where you can voluntarily be banned from casinos. And in some states, this is also extended to lotteries. And then once you've signed up for this program, and they've made sure that it's truly voluntary, you weren't under coercion or under the influence of substances at the time, you will be arrested for entering casinos. Oh, sorry. Okay, so there's a whole class of things helping people with self-regulation. In other areas of so-called behavioral anomalies, I don't see that so clearly. Demand for information, maybe, is a little iffy. Like when people pay for consumer reports, they might just be paying for information, so that wouldn't be paying for assistance making better decisions necessarily. But if people are paying for essentially an objective framing to allow them to see through the fog of the information that they already know, essentially, then that might constitute demand for assistance, but that's an iffier case. When it comes to context effects and these other heuristics and biases, I just don't really see any evidence whatsoever for demand for journalism by the regulated. So even moving away from these behavioral anomalies that behavioral economics has identified, there's also this whole other class of behavioral economics that, if anything, says that government intervention is less necessary than we might have previously believed. And I don't even have to actually talk too much about this because Molly Thrasher yesterday had a very wonderful talk on this exact topic, and even mentioned Lynn Ostrom, who's a hero of mine. She won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for her work on governance of the commons, and her overall body of work essentially says that informal government works really well. So purely informal arrangements between private citizens on a voluntary basis seems to work really well. My own research is also on the effectiveness of just social norms on regulating human behavior, altruism as well. We don't necessarily, I think everyone here recognizes we don't need the government to step in and provide many services that a lot of people would reflexively say we do, because people will voluntarily provide those things in the absence of a government role. So one example of the smooth functioning, in fact smoother functioning of an unregulated scenario compared to a scenario where the government has set strict regulations is this experiment called Naked Streets, which I don't recommend, or I do recommend, depending on your preferences, typing into Google image search, as I discovered. But this is an experiment in a lot of European cities where they have gotten rid of traffic lights and signage and seen a dramatic improvement in traffic flow in a lot of cases. So it seems like even in complicated roundabouts and intersections, people just, amazingly enough, are able to function just fine. All right, so what? Some mistakes are real. I have a proposed criterion for making sure that mistakes, alleged mistakes, are in fact real mistakes. And they do exist occasionally. So what? Does that really mean that we need the government to step in? I personally believe no. I think actually one of the most striking things about that list of examples of commitment devices where we see demand for assistance is that every single one of them, except for the voluntary exclusion programs, are private sector solutions to these issues. So once, sort of as you might expect, once there's a demand for something, the market tends to provide it. But even if that's not the case, even if it's not provided and it is a true mistake, do we really need the government to adopt a more paternalistic stance? No, in my opinion. I think it's important that we don't commit the mistake ourselves of ignoring valuable information that's inconvenient to us. And so now that we have all this evidence that people do in fact maybe make some mistakes, we shouldn't try and sweep that under the rug, but we should go back to basics and realize that freedom and liberty was never predicated on perfect decision making in the first place. We only ever wanted people to take responsibility for their mistakes if they do make them, and that has not changed. Mistakes do not imply paternalism, and I think that's what we should be focusing on, not so much arguing against behavioral economics as a science. So in conclusion, just to reiterate, behavioral economics is not necessarily about people making mistakes and bad decisions overall. A lot of times it's about people making better decisions than the classical model might allow for. And regardless, I do not think this is a threat to liberty at all. And if any of you are interested in further reading, there's actually quite a bit of discussion on behavioral economics and public policy since Nudge came out. So.
Thanks, Vera. So we have time for one question. Yep, Taya.
Hi. In a lot of discussions I have with non-libertarians, an example would be on an issue like smoking regulation. A lot of the time I find that people are supporting government policy because I've often talked to smokers who support government policy on smoking because they see government as a commitment device. I was just wondering how this sort of work intersects with things like public choice theory and politics in general and people's relationship with government.
I think this goes back to the fundamental debate that libertarians have in general is should we use government as a tool to solve various problems? And the libertarian stance tends to be no, private sector solutions work better and are less interfering with liberty. And I think that's the exact same issue with smoking. Some people might choose to ask the government to solve that particular problem, and I think most of us here would prefer private sector solutions. So I think that's a special case of this broader debate on policy.
Okay, thank you, Vera. I'd like to give you this one. So thank you for speaking.